Hello everyone, I'm Braden Burkhart, and welcome to Unreal Engine 5. That's right, we finally have early access, to the new Unreal Engine. I thought what not better way to start and explore Unreal Engine 5, which I gotta say, from the past few days I've had access to it. There's some crazy cool features that we will be diving into. But I just wanted to start off by creating a new tutorial series for people who've never really gone into Unreal Engine before. And also maybe if you have but you want to, refresher for more advanced things or just, I don't know how materials work for example and I want to know how all that works or how characters work or lighting or any of that good stuff. So this series we're not gonna make a single game, but instead what we're gonna do is we're going to dive into a little bit of everything each video and explore a single topic. Today we'll be starting by creating our project as well as creating our first character. So I have already loaded Unreal Engine 5 and I am met with this screen. I have already selected games because we're going to be programming games, and you can see here there's some sample projects. Now, a lot of people would start off with either the first person or third person to start off with, but I actually like to start from complete scratch and create a blank project. Then we also on the bottom right here, we actually have some project defaults, some settings we could use. I always like to select C++. C++ is going to give us more options. However, we still are able to use blueprints in C++. So we have the added benefit of being able to program while still using blueprints. And we'll be using blueprints throughout this tutorial series as it's easier to follow along. And if you already have C++ experience, it's not too hard to convert that to C++. Our target platform will be desktop. Our quality will be maximum. Yeah, I do want to start with starter content, so we'll have that ticked. And there's no need for ray tracing in this project, but if you would like to, you can enable that. I'm gonna name my project. I'll just name it tutorial project. You can name it whatever you want. And my project location is good enough for what it is right now. If you want to change it, you could either type it out here or you could browse your location. Anyway, I'm going to create the project, and this may take a few minutes at first. So it's creating a project, and it depends on how big of a project it is. If you're loading a project after you've created it, it'll typically be a lot faster than when you first create it. So I will jump forward till when it is created. Great, so now that the project has been created, you see that we started off in this weird chair and table kind of floating scene with some clouds. You also may have noticed if you have Visual Studios installed that it went ahead and opened Visual Studios. Now we're not going to be doing any programming in C++, so we don't really need this for now. So I'm just going to close out of Visual Studios, and we're just going to use Unreal Engine for this. You also see in the bottom here how it says project files out of date. Would you like to update it? Yeah, I'm just going to click update, make sure everything's all good. Now you also may notice that my engine editor might look slightly different than yours. For example, I have some extra tabs here. I have world partition and I have world settings in this tab, as long as your standard world outliner and details, which you should have. And that's because I just like having these tabs here just for when I need to edit. If you ever need to refer to these, you can go to top under window and you can open these. For example, your world settings, which we'll talk about later, as well as your world partition, which we'll talk about later. You also at the bottom here see that I have a content browser. I like the Unreal Engine 4 style where I've always have a content browser showing. You could also open it from window, I believe, or maybe not from window. They have changed some stuff, so maybe there's a separate setting for that. I would have to figure that out. But For you, it's going to be a different setting where if you do control space, it actually will pop up with a, I forgot what they call it. They call it the content drawer. And so it's a way that you could instead would have it be able to have it larger while still having access to that. But I always like having my content browser up. I also think that these folders are a little bit too big. I would like to see more content, per area. So I like to go under settings when I create a project and go to thumbnail size and then go to small. Okay, that looks good for what I want. Now, we started off in this scene. I don't like to start off in this scene. It lets you see what's going on easier in terms of what you need to have for a basic scene, but this is slightly outdated, and you'll see why in a second. If you wondered how I moved, I use my scroll wheel on my mouse. You could also hold right click to look around using your mouse. And if you're holding right click, you could use your WASD keys to move around, just like if you're in like spectator view in a game. If you look around though, you can see how the clouds look alright, but this is using a sky sphere, and we want to be using volumetric clouds, at least for Unreal Engine 5, because we have access to that now. But we also have some extra stuff. So instead of deleting all this and redoing it, I am just going to make a new level. And what a level is kind of like a map almost, except for it also stores some extra information, which we'll go over another day. To create a new level, we can go to File, and on the top here it says New Level. I'm going to click that. It's going to give me some options for what I want, and I just want an empty level. In this empty level, we have quite literally nothing but black with some grid outlines. The first thing I like to do when I create a new level is just to save it. So we're going to do Control S to save. And now it's going to give me an option, or a pop-up, asking where I want to save that new level at. I like to save levels in a separate folder. So we're going to go ahead and create a new folder by right-clicking New Folder. And I'm going to name this Levels. Now, because we only have one level, and we're only going to have one level for a while, I'm just going to save it directly in the levels. Now, if I had multiple levels, I would create multiple folders and save it in that respective folder per level. I'm going to name this level Tutorial Level and click Save. It updated in my content browser. If I double click on levels, now I can see I actually have that level in there. If I save again, that's all good, and we're ready to now populate our level with things. What things would that be? Well, the first thing that we need is atmosphere, right? We don't want just a single black thing. We want to actually have a sky. So if you see on our left side, we have a tab called Place Actors. And right below it, we could either search for our classes, or we could just browse from these various categories. If we go under the star icon called Visual Effects, we have some options that we could place. And we're going to do a sky atmosphere. We're going to take that, hold left click, and we're going to drag that in our scene. Cool, so now we can see it in our level, and we also could see in our world outliner that we have a sky atmosphere. The world outliner is an easy way to see everything in your world, or in your level. If you want to organize this better, which you definitely should when you get more complex levels, you could right-click to create a new folder. And that way you can keep organized. So we're going to go ahead and create a new folder. And we're going to call this folder Atmosphere. And we're going to store all of our atmosphere, fog, clouds, and lighting stuff in that. I'm going to go ahead and drag this into a folder. And now I can see it's in that folder because it's indented. And if I was to minimize that folder, it would go inside. Great, but why is it still a black screen? Well, that's because we don't have our lighting set up correctly. In fact, we don't have any lighting at all. So if we go under the light bulb icon in our place actors, we could do a directional light. A directional light is going to simulate our sun for us. So we're going to drag that also into our scene to place. But it still is not working. And that's because the directional light hasn't been set up correctly to interface with our sky atmosphere. To do so, we're going to go on our right panel in Details. Details has all the information we need of parameters, setting up, materials, and all that good stuff, which there's a lot of stuff, but one good rule of thumb is the 80-20 rule. You're going to be using 20% of these details about 80% of the time. So you really only need to master those 20% of details to really get a good grasp for all this stuff. So we're going to scroll down, and one of the categories we're going to see is atmosphere and clouds. We're going to want to check that first box called atmosphere sunlight, because it's sunlight. So we're going to click that, and all of a sudden we see in our level, or in a viewport, sorry, this is a viewport, this is like our screen. If we look up, we have the sun and we have atmosphere. And atmosphere actually is already all set up for us. So if you actually see, we actually have kind of more white towards the horizon, and it gets more blue as we look up, which is correct, how it should be in real life. I'm also going to drag that directional light into our atmosphere just to keep it organized. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to add a skylight in our place actors. So we're going to drag a skylight in now. A skylight kind of it allows us to add lighting, indirect lighting basically. If you were to notice in real life, in shadowed areas, there's still a little bit of light. It's not pitch black. So we need to add indirect lighting to all that stuff, which is exactly what the skylight does. It basically adds universal light to our scene. So that's all good, and that's already all set up for us. We just need to put that in our atmosphere folder now. And the last thing, or two more things we want to add. We want to add fog, and we want to add clouds. So in our visual effects, which is our star icon, we're going to want to add volumetric clouds. If we drag that in, you notice immediately we get volumetric clouds. In Unreal Engine 5, we're able to actually add layers. We can paint clouds. We can add a ton of different things. But for now, we're just going to keep it like this. We're not going to mess with it too much, just because there's a lot of settings that can get really complex, and that's enough stuff just for a single video. So we'll cover that eventually. And then the last thing we want to add is we want to add exponential height fog, which is basically fog. And so when you drag that in, you'll also notice that because it adds fog in the distance, that below us we also have, it gets blue because the fog scattering actually is also applied below us. So now if we look around by holding right click and doing our WSAD, we could look around and we could see all those things are clumped together and all is good. And we have all the clouds, our basic sun, and all that good stuff. I'm also going to make sure that volumetric clouds and exponential height fog is also in my atmosphere folder. So if I was to minimize the atmosphere, it would be all compact. Cool. So the next thing we want to add is we want to add a ground. Normally we would add something like a terrain, but a terrain can get pretty complex for just a first tutorial. So what we're going to do instead is we're just going to add a basic plane. To do so, we're going to go up into our geometry, in our, to find it, in our shapes, the box icon, and there's a plane. And we're going to drag that plane out to where it looks good. And if we look around, it's a little bit small for a ground for now. So what we're going to want to do is we want to scale that up. In our details panel, on the top, there's a transform category. That transform area allows us to move the location, we could rotate the object, or we could scale it. In this case, we're going to want to scale. So because we want to universally scale all axes as the same amount, we could actually easily click this lock icon, and if it's locked, as soon as we change one of these scalings for our axis, it will change all of them at the same time. So instead of having a 1 scale, let's start off with 10. And we immediately notice that the other 2 axes get populated immediately. If you were to only want to scale 1 axis per time, or edit anything on 1 axis per time, that could be rotation or locations or anything, to easily know what axis is what, if you notice, whenever you click on an object, and any object, it will have some arrows, which you could actually drag and move. And these are color-coded with that stuff, with your red being your X, green being Y, and blue being Z. If you would like to switch from a movement type when you drag to rotation, you could simply click E, and it'll come up with the rotation tool. And you can do the same thing and rotate your objects around. You can also click R to have the scaling enabled, and you can go back to your transform location by pressing W. You can also stop snapping, because if you notice when you move, it snaps a bit, especially with like rotation. It snaps every 10 degrees. If you would like to stop or change the amount of snapping, on your top right in your viewport, if you click, you can actually alter snapping, the amount, or you can click the blue icons, which enable or disable snapping for your transform of location, rotation, or scaling. Okay, that's great. But if we were to, let's actually save first. You may notice there's a play icon on top. We can click play, but immediately what's going to happen if we click on our viewport is we can move around with WSAD, but we're in like a spectator view. And we want to create a basic WSAD character, not a spectator view. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there are a few things that we need to first do to set that up. The first is, let's tell the game where we should actually have the player spawn at in the first place. To do so, we're going to need a player start actor. So in your place actors, under basic, there's a player start with a flag and a joystick or controller. If we drag that out, you'll notice, and you let go, it's a capsule. And that's because that's based roughly how tall a normal human player would be. And if you look carefully, you'll also notice there's an extra arrow, a blue arrow. That blue arrow is going to be what direction the player is going to defaultly face at when they spawn in. We could rotate using E and the blue to edit where they're going to look at when spawning to start. So we're going to have them point towards the middle of that plane. And then we're going to click W to go back to scaling. Great. So if we press play, now we start off there, but we're still in spectator view. So now we actually got to create the character. So let's create some stuff in our content browser. So at the bottom here in your content browser, on the top, we're going to go back to our root folder content. And we're going to make a new folder. So we're going to right click. There's a lot of stuff which we'll talk about later. But at the top, there's a new folder icon. We're going to click that. And we're going to name this to character. We're going to go in that folder. We're going to right click. And we're going to create a few blueprint classes. So when you click on the blueprint class, it's going to give us some options for what we want to make. This is for the common area. If we were to click all classes, you'll quickly notice there's a lot of classes. Most of them you'll never actually encounter. And that's why they have the common classes up here, just because this is the most common ones that you could use. So the first one we're going to create is we're going to create a game mode base. A game mode base kind of sounds like what it is. It stores game mode information, how the player should work, how scoring should work, how points work, how your game works, how if you were to make a multiplayer game, how does how does ranks work and all that stuff. So we're going to click on that. We're going to create a game mode base. And I'm going to name this. Tutorial game mode. Okay, but we still need the character itself. So let's right click, go to back to blueprint class, and we're going to create a character. But let's talk about what a character actually is. So a character, it says, is a type of pawn that includes the ability to walk around. Basically what a character is it's a human version of a pawn. What is a pawn? Well, a pawn is an actor that has AI. What is an actor? Well, an actor is kind of the base object for objects. If I was to create a door that can move, I would create an actor. If I created ammo that I could pick up in my game, I would create an actor. And so everything has to be an actor. And the next level higher than that would be a pawn, which has some extra stuff. So if I was to create, an animal, for example, I would use a pawn. If I was to create, a box that can move around with pathfinding, I would use a pawn. If I was to create a human, pawn, I would instead use a character, because a character is a pawn with added human abilities. And in this case, we're going to want a character. And we're going to use this character as the base character player for our player. So we're going to click on that, and we're just going to call it tutorial character. And there's one more thing we need to know, and that is we need to have something to control that character. So back in our blueprint class, we're going to create a player controller, which you can see here. It says a player controller is an actor responsible for controlling a pawn used by the player. So we're going to create a controller, and we're going to call it tutorial controller. And I'm going to save all by Control-Shift-S. That's all great, but before we edit all that stuff, what we need to do is we need to tell the game mode what character and what controller we're going to use. So we're going to double click on our game mode, and it gave us a new pop-up. If you would like to keep everything as one window, which I like, you could drag this tab up here into this major tab or major window, and then you have tabs, which I like. So under tutorial game mode, there's a lot of information, but all we're really focused on is the stuff on the right. In particular, we want to have the player controller class, which we're going to now switch to our tutorial controller, which actually now shows up. And we want to change our default pawn class to our tutorial character, which is right here. There's actually already a tutorial character made here, but we want the one that I named with the underscore. Now that's all we need actually to do for our game mode. It's that easy. But before we actually exit out of this, we need to, on the top here, there's a compile option, and we need to compile, which now has the green check mark, and then we need to save. And then we can close out of that tab. The next step is we need to tell the world what game mode to use. And that's why I have the world settings tab here next to my details. Just as a reminder, if you want to get to that world settings tab, you would go to Window, World Settings, and it'll make the pop-up. And you can move this tab around wherever you need to. Like I can move it over here if I wanted to. I can move it. I like to have it next to my details because it's kind of a world details type thing. And so, anyway, on the second section, you'll notice there's a game mode, and we want to override that game mode. If we click on it, we'll actually see we have our tutorial game mode show up. If we click on that, it's all set now. And if we were to maximize the thing below it called selected game mode, we'll notice that it actually has auto-filled all that stuff. And in this case, we actually have the ability, if we wanted to override some stuff. But in this case, because we already have our game mode set up how we want it to, we're not going to do that. Let's save again. And now we're ready to actually start creating our character. The first step to do so is we need to assign, well, keys to do so, in particular keybinds for walking, how we could actually look around, if we want to jump, crouch, sprint, and all that stuff. To do so, we're going to go into project settings. There's a few ways to go into project settings. The way I like to go into it is by clicking Edit, Project Settings, and it's going to create a new tab. And now we could edit a ton of stuff as part of the project itself. What we're interested in is under Engine, Input. So let's click on that. And on the top section, we have Bindings. And there's two sections. There's action mappings and axis mappings that we could add to. An axis mapping is for ranges of values. For example, if I wanted to make a game that supports consoles with controllers, a joystick has the ability to go all the way forward, halfway forward, part right, and all that stuff. And even some fancy keyboards are analog and allow you to have ranges of different presses. And so for movements, we would want to have axis mappings, and also our mouse is a range of values. So we want our mouse inputs to be axis. And then for action mappings, we want it to be single click events. If I was to jump by pressing space, that's an action. If I want to hold shift to sprint, that's an action. If I want to press I for inventory, that's an action. So first, let's cover our axis mappings. So we're going to click the add icon. And now we're going to maximize that. And we have this box here. So let's rename this box. Let's start with move forward. So we're going to type in, let's type in move_forward. And then press enter. And you notice when you do that, it actually will auto maximize that section for you. And now we can assign a key for that. So I'm going to assign for forward W. So I'm just going to search W, and under keyboard we can select W. The scale itself is how much influence it has. And so that's actually going to be helpful, because if you think about it, moving backwards is equivalent of moving forward negatively. So what we can actually do to make it easy for us to program is we can actually add in our move forward section another button key, and we can actually add S, which is backwards. If we scroll down to find S right here, keyboard S, we can actually have it as a negative scale, -1 in particular. So now it's going to move forward -1ly, which is going to make our programming easy. So moving forward is done. Let's add a new axis mapping, and we're going to name this one move right, and we're going to have the same setup. So we're going to, for right, do D, and we're going to select D, and then we're going to add our left also in here, A, and we're going to have that as -1. Okay, so WSAD is set up. Let's now do our mouse movements. So let's name this one look vertical. And this is going to be called mouse Y. And then we're going to do our look. Oh, let me maximize that. Our look horizontal. And we're going to have that as our mouse X. So we have WSAD and our mouse setup. Let's now do action mappings, because axis is finished. So this is going to be a question of what you want to include for your character. Today we're going to do jumping, crouching, and sprinting. So let's first do our jump. So if I press plus, and we're going to expand that, let's add jump. And for jump, I am going to do space, or space bar. You also notice in your action mappings, you have the ability to do Shift, Control, Alt, and Command. One thing to note is, well, actually, let's talk about it right now. So jumping's all set up. Let's add crouch. And let's say, for example, we want our crouch to be left control. Some people might say, okay, so let's just do control, and we're all good to go, right? No, this is for if you want to do a combined sets. If we want to do like Control H, Control X, and all that stuff. If we just want to have left control be our crouch, we're just going to come in here and we're just going to type in CTRL and then do left control from that way. You know, we need one more. We need sprint, and then I'm gonna have sprint as shift, as left shift. If you wanted to, you could also add another one to do right shift and all that stuff, but I'm not gonna do that. Okay, inputs are all finished. Now we can close out of project settings, and now we get to do blueprint programming for our character. If I was to do a more complex and an actual full game, what I would do is I would program all of my movement logic and all that in my controller class. But that's a little bit more complex, especially for our first tutorial. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to program that in our tutorial character, which will be perfectly fine for a single player game. But if you were to do, I guess, even a more complex single player game that has some pretty advanced stuff, or you were to do a multiplayer game, you should program all your logic in your controller. Because if you think about it, your character, if you die, you respawn a new character technically, but you keep your controller. So if you were to have all your logic in your character, that would get deleted every single time you die and respawn, which is not good if you want to keep track of, points and all that stuff. So we're not going to actually even touch our controller. That's all fine. We're going to input all this in our character. So we're going to double click on our character, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put the tab up in top. And now we can actually see a lot of stuff in here. And that's because if you think about it, this character has all the stuff a pawn has, and a pawn has all the stuff a actor has with more stuff. So we have stuff from actors, pawn, and characters all in this one class. So there's gonna be a lot of stuff in here that we could edit. So it's gonna be it's a little overwhelming just how much details there are, because if you click on any of the components section, which is like the parts of this class on your left side, you'll notice that everything has separate details. The only thing that we really care about though, in terms of components and your details, is the bottom one, which is your character movement, which has stuff like walking, sprinting, jumping, swimming, crouching, jumping, all that stuff. So, and that's what we want to edit. And we're going to edit some of this stuff later on. But we want to program all this stuff. Now, this is where you would add like your character model, your skeletal mesh and all that stuff. But we're not going to be dealing with all of that because that can get pretty long right now. So instead what we're going to do is more of the old school way, like kind of like how like Half-Life and all those games were, where you don't like your character's invisible to you. So if you look down, you don't see your feet or anything, but it's still going to work. It's still going to have a collision box. It's still going to have all that stuff. In fact, this capsule is actually our collision box. If we were to now go into our blueprint editor by going to event graph, we're met by these 3 nodes. We actually could just hold left click and drag and delete all this stuff. We're actually going to start from scratch too, just because I like starting from scratch so you know what you're actually doing. And now all we need to do is, we need to link our keybinds to what we actually want our character to do. So if we right click, we could search and add a ton of different like nodes or blocks of code. So the first thing we're going to do is I want to search for our keybinds. The first one's our move input. So I'm going to do move underscore forward. And there's two different ones we have. We have access values and access events. We want to get the access event because an event gets triggered when it happens. So if I was to press W or S, because remember we also have S linked to this, it would trigger that event. When access values just gets that value, it doesn't actually turn anything on or do anything. So we want to click the event. And events are always going to be red, which is going to be very helpful. And we have two things here that we can connect. We also have this red one, but that's a really complex thing for now, so we're not going to get into that. But this white one is what we care about as of now. This white one is going to be the thing that gets triggered when this thing is done. So as soon as our event gets triggered, anything connected to this white is going to trigger after it. And then anything connected to that next one on that white node is going to be triggered after that. So it's node programming. So it's basically like a web of stuff being activated. So we can actually just hold left click, and we can drag off of that. And we actually can just directly search and connect a node up to this. So if we move forward, what do we want it to do? Well, we want to move this object. And one of the nodes we can use for this is called an add movement input, which is right here. So we're going to click and we're going to add a movement input. There's a few options here we have. Target is going to be self because we want to alter the class it's in by itself. The world direction, we'll talk about that in a second. Scale value, well, remember how we actually set our scale values in our bindings already? Like with the 1, -1 and all that? Well, that's what actually this green over here is connected to. So we could actually link these up by holding left click and dragging, connecting. And then we don't need any force for that. So this add movement input is great because it's going to add movement. It's going to allow us to add a location offset. So basically we can move every frame. But it doesn't know if we're going to move forward, backwards, left, or right. We know the scale, but we don't know the actual direction. And that's what the world direction is going to be for. What direction should this class move in relation to the entire world? So if we drag off of this yellow one, what we're going to search for is a get actor, because we're an actor, forward vector. And that's all we need for that. So we're going to basically make an entire another one for our move right. So we're going to type in move right. We're going to add the event. We're going to add the movement input. We're going to combine the scales again. And then under world direction, instead of get actor forward vector, we're going to get actor right vector. And we can highlight this and move it all around to make it cleaner. And because this is actually all we need for WSAD, we're gonna actually put this in its own thing just to keep it organized. So if we select all these, you could press C, and now we can actually add basically like a box around it just to keep it simple. I'm gonna call this WASD. And on top, we're gonna compile and save. And if we go back to our tutorial level and we play, we actually now have access to WASD, all set up, all ready to go. But if you notice, we don't have any mouse inputs yet because we haven't set up our mouse yet. So let's do that next. Back to tutorial character. I'm just gonna do it on the right side over here. We want to get our look vertical, which is what we set up earlier. And we want that also to be an access event. And we want this time it's gonna be called add controller, and either we could do pitch, roll, or yaw. If you know the differences, pitch is gonna go up and down, so we want to do pitch. And we want to link the axis value also to your value. And that's actually all we need to do for that one. So let's do that again for horizontal. So look, horizontal. And we're going to add controller yacht input this time. Or don't forget to link your values up. And now what we need to do is we're going to comment. We're going to highlight comment, and we're going to just say, or we can just call it look. We'll just call it look logic. It's up to you to name. We're going to compile and save and see if that works. Okay, so if you actually notice, there's something wrong with this. If you're just watching the video, you might not be able to tell, but I can look left and right fine. But if I look up, I actually look down, and if I look down, I actually look up. So the vertical is actually inverted. So how can we uninvert the mouse vertical? Well, there's two ways we could do it. Either we can multiply this value by -1 to invert, or we can go back under Edit, Project Settings, Input, and we could take the look vertical and change the scale to -1 and just invert it in this. And you don't need to save in Project Settings, it auto-saves for you. And if we press play, now we'll notice the mouse input actually works how it should, which is all great. Now let's actually add our jump information, or logic. So we already set up our jump action mapping, so we're going to do jump. There's quite a few jump things, but instead what we want is we want the action events jump. And we have a pressed and a released. We don't really care about the released, we just want it to call a single jump when we press. So we're going to under pressed, if we type in jump, you can actually see how there's some blue functions, just jump and stop jumping, that we could use. We're just going to call it jump. We don't need to actually worry about it stop jumping because it's going to go back to the ground and stop jumping for us. So we're going to compile and save and see if that works. For jump, it works how it's supposed to. If we want to edit how high we jump, we can go under our character movement over here, and if you scroll down, and there's a character movement jumping, falling, and you can actually see and control all this stuff. So jump Z velocity, I'm going to change that to like 350 or like 300 instead, and then compile and save and see what that looks like. And now I jump a lot more, I guess, realistically. It's up to you how you want it to have it. Okay, jump's finished, so let's highlight and comment jump. Now let's do our crouching. So same thing, we're going to type in crouch, and we're going to find our action event to crouch. And under pressed, this is up to you how you want to have it. I'm going to have it so you have to hold it. When you hold crouch, it crouches, and when you release, it releases the crouch. If you want to do a toggle, there's a few different ways that you could do that, such as Boolean values and all that. But I'll show you both ways. So the first way is just to hold it down. So under pressed, we could just have it crouch. And when you release it, we want it to, well, uncrouch. And if we compile and save, and we do control, nothing happens. Why is nothing happening? Well, that's actually because, for some reason, Unreal Engine has crouching normally disabled or defaultly disabled. So let's enable it. So click character movement. On your right side under your details, you could search crouch. And at the bottom here, there's a Boolean that says can crouch. Check that to true. And now if you compile and save, crouching will work. So now we can crouch. Now because it's instant, and that's because we don't have any animations linked up, we'll go over how we can set up animations to actually make that smoother and more realistic. Let's go back. We're finished with that. So just, actually, we're not finished with that. Let's actually talk about how we could set it up so it's a toggle instead. So I'm going to delete these two things. We want to have it so it's a Boolean value. So what's a Boolean? A Boolean is a true or false value. So we want it so when we click or press Control one time, crouch becomes true and it becomes crouched. And when we press it again, crouch becomes false and it decrouches. How do we actually make it variable in Blueprints? Well, on the side, left side here, you'll notice there's a variable section. We're going to click the plus icon, and it actually defaultly makes this a Boolean value, which is pretty nice for us. So we're going to name this is crouched. And in order to save it, in order to assign a generic default value, we're going to compile and save. And you can see in the right of here in details, now in the bottom it shows your default value. We're going to leave that to unchecked because we want the defaultly the player to be standing. Okay, so now we don't really care about what it does when it's released. We just care about when it's pressed for the first time. So under pressed, we're going to check if it's crouched or not already. How do we do that? Well, we use what's called a branch. So let's type in branch. And a branch is basically just an if statement. And we could drag our is crouched Boolean onto that condition. And will actually automatically give us a reference to that, which is quite nice. So, okay, so if we press it and is crouched is true, we want it to uncrouch. So let's uncrouch. And if we press it and is crouched is false, we want it to crouch. And the last thing we want it to do is if, well, we actually have to reassign is crouched to the opposite and change it up. So let's go to back and drag the variable to, if we drag the variable on this, it's going to allow us to set it. So we're going to do that twice. And so if we uncrouched, we want it to be false. And if it does crouch, we want it to set it to true. And if we compile and save that, you'll notice that if we press Control, it's a toggle now. Nice and simple. And now I'm just gonna keep it like that. I'm gonna crouch. And it's up to you which way you want it. If you want it to be a toggle or hold crouch, that's just up to you as the game designer. One more thing we need to do now, and that is our sprint. So the sprinting is a little bit weird because we need to set it to different things. We're not going to worry about how crouching or actually disregard that. So first of all, let's get our action mapping actually. So let's type in sprint, and we have our action events, all great. So what do we actually want this to do? Well, similarly to our or it's up to you if you want it to be a toggle or a hold. I'm gonna have the sprint as a hold because I kind of like older school games that have the holding. If we're doing kind of like how we're doing already, I just want it to be a hold to sprint. So if we press it, we want the character's speed to increase, right? Because we want the sprint. Well, so let's figure out where we could alter that in our character movement up here. So we're going to click on that in components. We actually notice in our character movement, we have all that info. There's nothing that we see in there. If we scroll down, oh, look at that. Character movement walking. We actually have max walk speed regular and max walk speed crouched. And that's set at 600 and 300. That's a bit high for walking. So I want to actually set that to a default value of lower. So I'm going to have our walk speed as like 300 and our crouch speed as like 100. Bring that to a more realistic walking speed. Now I want to be able to alter that max walk speed. How do I actually do that? Well, if you try to drag out of here, like max walk speed, it's actually not going to show anything. And that's because all these things that like the uncrouched, crouch and all that stuff is for the entire, it's like the global thing for the entire actor. When those variables that we were seeing over there are inputs or parameters are only for the character movement itself. So when you get a reference to the character movement, well, how do we do that? Well, we can actually just drag out and we need to get the reference of a character movement. So out of this node, now we can do max walk speed, and we can actually set max walk speed regular and crouched. So let's get those two. So max walk speed crouched. So now we have the two regular ones. I'm going to bring this up, and let's link all these. So we're going to set first max walk speed normal, and then we'll set to crouched. Technically, the crouched is going to be set after the regular, but that's just because of ordering. It's going to basically do it instantly. So let's set the max walk speed when sprinting from 300, which is our new default reset, to something like 500. And let's set our crouch speed to like 250. Actually, let's set like 200. Okay, so now let's reset it back to normal. So I'm just going to copy these two and paste, and now we get those. And I'm going to link the released. And when we release it, we just want to set to a default while it's reset, which is 300, and it was 100. And then we got to make sure to take our targets and set our targets to our character movement. Let's compile and save. Comment, sprint. I'm going to save that again. And if we go back and play, if we walk, we can see the speed, and if we hold shift, we can see how we go faster. And if we crouch, we notice that we're slow, and if we sprint, we go slightly faster. And that is all good. We have all that set up. The last thing to note is if you want to set your crouch actually height, which I forgot to mention, if you're under character movement, there's an area somewhere over here where you could set your crouch height right here. Under character movement general settings, there's a crouched half height, and you could set how high your player crouches. So if you want to do something like Arma, where you could set how high you're crouching from the player, you could program something to alter that value right there, and link that to your animations and player and whatnot if you have a 3D model for that. But that's it for getting started with creating your first character. So now that you've created your first character, you can start to alter, add inventories, and in future videos, we're going to cover all the information to basically be able to create a basic game. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for future videos, and I will see you all next time.